I'd like to introduce Veronica Brown. Many of you in this room probably know her already. She's a local historian. She has two other series that she has done for us that you can find on YouTube. Google Kingsville Community Center, YouTube, you'll find our thing. And then she's got, I think, 6 videos so far. We've done 2 sets of 3. This is the first in her 3rd series with us. And
I have a third season.
You have a 3rd season.
Yeah, I've been commissioned for a 3rd season.
That's right. That's right. And for some reason we do them in sets of 3. I'm not sure why, but it's just been working out that way. So we have a second one in March and another one in April. If you're interested, you do have to register. If not, you can register at the door like today. And I will turn it over to Veronica. Thank
Wonderful.
you so much.
My mic working okay?
It should be working okay.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, welcome. Thanks for coming out on such a cold morning. I'm sure I'll make this worth your while because it's a very interesting topic. So we are talking about exploring Kingsville's Black history, and we're kind of isolating on a local character that lived in Kingsville for a very long time, commonly known as Old Wash, and we'll get into his history as well. So we're going to start off a little bit about Old Wash, and this is his obituary, and these are actual photos of this gentleman that I was able to access through the Kingsville archives. They have a bunch of these photos. So any photos that come up are actually of Old Wash. And so here we have him passing away in 1916. So this obituary is from the Windsor Star, but I'm going to read to you from the Kingsville Reporter's obituary to give you a little idea about this guy. Henry Washington, oh, you know what? I think I'm missing something. Okay, so usually I have a blurb that goes up that talks about the fact that when you're going through historical documents, you're going to find troublesome language. And so I want to let you know that we still use that language when we're talking, not the really awful ones, but we will refer to it because it does keep it in context of when it was written. So you're going to hear me say some problematic words and language, but I'm always using it when I am actually quoting from contemporaneous resources. So we begin right off with Henry Washington, Kingsville's only colored resident. He passed away this afternoon. He was the oldest man in the county, anywhere from 100 to 118 years old. Henry was at one time a slave in the South, but made his escape to Canada perhaps 60 years ago or longer, and has since resided in Gosfield South or in Kingsville. He acquired some property here, which he held until a few years ago when he sold it to Mr. C.A. Quick. Mr. Quick put him in a little home where he lived until his death. For some years, he had been growing feeble and was not able to work. His wants were few and simple, and no one refused him anything he needed. He was around the streets as usual until a week ago when he was taken to his bed and the slowing down process began. When Dr. Jenner visited him at noon today, he found him very weak but able to talk and told him he had not long to live. And unfortunately, my email, no, I do not have a cursor to get down. That will be okay, well, I need it down here. Okay, here we go, we found it. For my notes, okay. So, talked to him and told me he had not long to live. Well, said he, I am taking the world easy and I'll soon be in the happy hunting ground. The town is giving him a Christian burial in Green Hill Cemetery tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Mr. Charles A. Quick is paying all funeral expenses. So that's a rather long obituary for someone in Kingsville. And so we're going to explore a little bit about Old Wash, as he was commonly known. But first we're going to go back to early people of color that came to settle in this area. So as you know, it wouldn't be one of my presentations without a map. So we have a map here, and this is a map of Essex County, and this is when it was originally surveyed. So this is in the 1790s, and only the lots that you see were the ones that were surveyed, and they were given out or were available to United Empire Loyalists and retired soldiers. So just to kind of get an idea of, in the 1790s, what this area looked like. And then in 1800 is when we got all our townships here, and it was an act for the division of Upper Canada into counties and then into townships. So that's when we start getting these lots, these farm lots that were usually around 200 acres that people could come and buy. So Gosfield, which is now Kingsville, was divided into farm lots that contained 200 acres, except for some of the ones along the lake. They were a little bit higher or lower in acreage. These are the ones that newcomers could come and buy. So here we have a map that was created in 1832, and it logged the owners of these farm lots. So in 1832, this is what the area looked like, and it showed you what land was available for newcomers. So this kind of giving you an idea, because it's after the 1830s that people of color started to come settle here. So I came up with this presentation because while I was researching Colonel James King, after whom Kingsville is named, I was given this resource from the Freedom Museum in Amherstburg. There had always been some oral history about Colonel King being sympathetic to people escaping enslavement, but I didn't have any documented proof. The earliest reference I had was from the 1950s, so I wasn't sure about that. But then I reached out to the Freedom Museum, and they led me to this book called The Refugee of the Narratives, or the Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada. And in this book, there is an excerpt. Now, this book is from 1856. And as you can see, when it talks about Gosfield, that here we had 78 citizens of color. Now, it's interestingly, it notes that all but 2 families were freeholders. And that's a really important distinction for our area. Because in talking with historians from Colchester and then into Amherstburg, what happened with people escaping enslavement, they would come to this area, and farmers who had uncleared land would lease these properties to people who would spend 10, 15 years clearing the land, getting it ready and farming it. And then when the lease expired, they were not given additional time, and they just had to leave, and all their hard work was had gone to the original owners. So the fact that they were able to come here and become freeholders was really important, because then they worked the land that they owned and no one could take away from them. So regarding the Black population, Colonel King is quoted, "They are good, loyal subjects and good, honest people. They are as moral as any people. There is no fault to be found with them at all." And so after reading about this, it got me interested in some of these early Black settlers. So here we have some of the Black property owners as of 1861. So I used the year 1861 because the 1861 census recorded the race of its residents. And I have access through the Kingsville archives to the assessment rolls, so the property rolls. So I was able to kind of, not just guess at who was a person of color and who wasn't. So here we have a list of the property owners and how many acres they owned. And then I was able to determine that this is where the properties were. So this area was owned by people of color. So I was also, through searching property records, so once I kind of found where these farms were, I was able to go back and research the property records, and I was able to document the dates that some of these properties were purchased. So sometimes people would come here and they would rent, but these were actual purchase deeds. So we have John W. Williams. He purchased his land in 1837. Thomas Johnson Sr. in 1847, Lewis King in 1849, John Chapman in 1851, and Henry Washington 1861. And this is Old Wash that we will go back to. So this gives you an idea of the area, the Black area. Now, actually, I will go just back a little bit. And this does show where the Shiloh Baptist Church was. And so that was a Black Baptist church. And then we had the Salem School. So a lot of times the Black community in Kingsville is referred to as Salem, although it was a mixed community. That's a lot of times, that's where the children of color would go to school. And that was established in 1864, and the church was 1868. And in fact, we have here a copy of the front of the deed for the Shiloh Baptist Church, and it was land donated by Mingo Jacobs in 1868. So he was prosperous enough, not only did he own his property, but then he was able to donate some to the local church. And the Shiloh Baptist Church, being established in 1868, the trustees all being local Black residents from this area. So we have a pretty interesting history of having Black ownership and Black communities here in this area. So also within this area, there was no actual cemetery Although that wouldn't have been unusual, because even in Kingsville, the Green Hill Cemetery, that didn't come about till about the 1880s. So at the time, if you owned a farm property and you had people passing away, you just had personal family cemeteries right on your own property. So there was always this talk about there being a cemetery of Black families, Black family cemeteries. And so in 2005, a group got together researching this, using oral history, using the stories from their grandparents about where this might be. And they were able to locate the county the burial site that had Black settlers there. Unfortunately, there's no records found, so there's no documentation of who's there. But so this is in 2005, and later that year, in September, the Kingsville Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee actually designated. They were able to locate the area. There was some stone pillars there. I'll show you in a bit what it looks like, and they were able to designate it as a heritage site. And they have a list of potentially who may or may not be buried there, but this is definitely on the stone that's at the cemetery, is the list of the Black families that lived here. And this is a great article because it talks about different people who had affiliations that came back for this unveiling. It was really important to the descendants of the Black settlers. So we have here retired Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Jacobs, the first African Canadian to achieve that rank in the Canadian Armed Forces, came from his home in Ottawa for the ceremony. And of course, Jacobs is the name. In fact, Mingo Jacobs was the one that donated the land for the church. So a lot of really rich history here. And I'm not aware of anyone actually diving deep into these families, but that's definitely an area that needs more exploring, I think. So to give you an idea of where this cemetery is, now I will say this, that this was 2005. And I remember the committee was really struggling with what to call the cemetery. And they reached out to now the Freedom Museum. At the time, it was the Canadian African Historical Society or something in Amherstburg. And at the time, they had said it was commonly known as the Negro Cemetery, so that should be called the Negro Cemetery. If that decision was being made now, perhaps that might not be the case. But at the time, the museum in Amherstburg was consulted, and that's how the name was chosen. So it does say, this is on the town website, the the Negro Cemetery, and this is the Google Street View, and this shows this is the new Memorial Gardens. And so if the tree to the left, that copse of tree right there, I have a better picture. This is where the cemetery is. So if you want to see the cemetery, go to the Memorial Gardens. It's just south in the southwest part, and you can kind of see the posts. They have these fieldstone posts that are there. And then this gives a little bit of background, and that is at the cemetery as well. Anyone here been to the cemetery? Hey, yes. Fabulous, yes. So when the snow melts, everyone go for a road trip because it's really it's a powerful place, absolutely. So we're going to go back now to Henry Washington, Old Wash. So in 1861, Washington owned a farmland, but he actually lived in Kingsville as a servant of the Augustine family. And Augustine family owned property like obviously Augustine Drive and the north part of Spruce Street is kind of like where the Augustines were. So you can see that in the census, he's listed as being a servant from the United States of the Augustine. Servant just meaning hired help. That was commonly used. If anyone that worked there. If you were a woman, you would be a domestic. If you were a man working for a family, it would be a servant. So I'd want to make that distinction right there. And then we see here at the bottom is the Land Abstract Index. So this is the index that shows all the different transactions on a piece of property. So at the bottom of the Land Abstract, it shows Washington purchasing 15 acres in the Salem area in 1850. So it's highlighted in green. And then also highlighted in green is the mortgage he took out with James W. King, who was Colonel King's son. So, and in fact, the farm, that 15 acres, was right next to another son of Colonel King's. So not only was Colonel King talking about, people of color come to this community and how they're valuable and valued citizens, he also, had no problem with the sons carrying on that, had no problem lending money, and then also living next to people of color, which I think is very interesting. So in 1873, even though he still owned the farmland, he did live in town. And in 1873, Washington purchased this lot on the corner of Division Street North and Beach Street, where he would live for over 40 years. So that's the highlighted area. So this is the Four Corners. This is an old map. And this shows where he is. So the property that he owned is now where the Red Apple is. That was originally his property. So, pretty, in town, a part of the original survey of Kingsville, and this was all desirable area right here, so he was able to purchase one. Okay, so a little bit about Old Wash. So Henry Washington was a beloved local character, and he was often written about in the local newspapers. And from the 1890s, an example is, Old Wash, our only colored citizen, has shook both of his overcoats, a sure sign that the spring season is on. It would definitely talk a lot about what he was wearing, and almost like he was like a lark, or, he let people know what was going on. And then again from the 1890s, our only colored citizen, Henry Washington, has blossomed out into a real estate magnate. He purchased the Cascadon property on Pearl Street a few days ago for $160. Mr. Washington does not intend to occupy his new property, but will remodel and otherwise improve his present residence. So he got into actually land ownership where he could lease it out to other people. And again, this is a picture of Old Wash himself. Other things written about him in the newspaper was, and he was beloved and written about all the time in the newspaper. This isn't even everything that was written. In 1897, it was reported, our only colored citizen has been to the Toronto Fair and enjoyed himself immensely. And the following year, 1898, Washington, our only colored citizen, has taken in the excursion to Ottawa this week. So obviously, with some money and being able to travel, hopefully freely and without incident. 1907, our old colored citizen Henry Washington, while sawing wood Monday last, had a fainting spell, but it only lasted a few minutes. So people very interested in the welfare of this gentleman. And later that year, our correspondent says that Wash has discarded his overcoat and hung it in the refrigerator, which is a dead sure sign that winter is here to stay. So I think it was Kingsville's early groundhog, I think. I'm thinking we need to have our own groundhog and name him Old Wash. That's what I'm thinking. Petition to be signed at next month's presentation. We'll have a petition for that. Written about Washington in an unknown publication, but this is in 1912. He is very much respected by the citizens of the town, as he has been a faithful servant to many of them. Now, at his advanced age, his chief occupation is visiting the young women of the town and telling their fortunes. He claims that he has been the means of making many matches among the young people. And so this is a picture. I'm so glad that we actually have documentation of him reading poems. And this unknown publication dated in 1912 again, called Henry Washington the oldest man in Canada, who was 116 years old. So I really wanted to kind of dive into that because going through the documents, I really found a fluctuation in his age. So in the 1861 census that we saw earlier, when he was with the Augustine family, he was listed as 40 years old. So that would be make him 91 years old in 1912 when this was published. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, document shows Washington's year of birth as 1830, making him 82 in 1912. And in the 1890s, his year of birth was recorded as 1835, making him 77 in 1912. And then in the 1901 census, Washington's birthday was listed in June, which would have made him 87 in 1912. So it did fluctuate, probably with the storytelling. I see him being this grand character and just, and quite honestly, as a lot of people escaping enslavement, coming to this area, no documentation of their birth. They don't know how old they are. They have no, that history is lost to them. So I think he just kind of made it up as he went along. Now, it was later in the 1900s that Washington's age became exaggerated, but it was always reported with affection. So from the Windsor Star in the 1912, he was written about in the Windsor Star a lot as well. Henry Washington, a well-known colored citizen of Kingsville who attended the Emancipation Day celebration at Sandwich, claims to be the oldest man in the whole of Canada. Washington's birthday is on August 19th, which is different than previously recorded. And if he likes, he will be 116 years old on that day. The oldest residents of Kingsville say they can remember Washington as far back as 1850. And at that time, he was gray-headed and bent. The old man was sold into slavery at the age of 4 in Kentucky, and for 46 years was owned by a Southern planter. He escaped to Canada previous to the outbreak of the Civil War. So that's a little bit of his history from 1912. Because Old Wash did go, when they would have emancipation celebrations, he would go every year, and he was kind of feted and almost like an unofficial grand marshal. So he was well known, not just in this area, but in Windsor as well, in Sandwich. So now we're going to talk about that Kingsville bylaw. So who here has heard that Kingsville used to have a bylaw where Black people could not own property in Kingsville? Or spend the night, yes. So that has been ongoing, and I moved to Kingsville in 2001. I started researching history a few years later, and that's always been something. And it's been something I've been actively looking for, because I really, if that is in fact true, we need to know about that. And I've heard lots of people tell me, I've seen it, but they cannot give me a copy of it. So when I was doing researching for this presentation, I really kind of dug deep into that. And so I think I may have an answer at this point, but history is evolving and history is humbling. But at this point, this is as far as I've gotten. So beginning in the 1920s, lakefront farms were being converted into subdivisions. And so this would have been considered outside of Kingsville, would be the municipality of Gosfield South. So a lot of times, farmers, you can see all the different subdivisions, the streets down along the lake. A lot of times, this is 1920s, these lots were being marketed to Americans. And because, they could come take the electric railway here, some people had cars, and a lot of the houses along the lake started off as cottages. So in these developments, and the deeds for these developments, they included covenants. And the covenants address the size of the houses to be built, construction materials, what kind of sewer system you would have, no outhouses, garages, and all that stuff. So it'd have these covenants covering all that, and also race restrictions. So these are photos of covenants taken from actual local property deeds. And of the 17 developments planned along the lake in Gosfield South, not Kingsville, from 1921 until 1937, 7 subdivisions had race restrictions. So we can see, I don't think I need to read this out loud, I'm sure you can all read, but these were the some of the race restrictions that were happening here. Now I will say that these covenants didn't just happen in Gosfield South, they happened all over Ontario. And it's interesting because it was upheld, these race restrictions in deeds were upheld by the courts until 1949. And I'm going to give you a little background into that. So the watershed real estate case began in April 1948 when Bernard Wolfe, a successful London, Ontario businessman, signed an agreement to buy a cottage property in the exclusive Beach O'Pine subdivision on the shores of Lake Huron near Grand Bend. So he hired a young lawyer fresh out of law school named Edward Richmond to handle the $6,800 purchase. So Richmond's title search disclosed a registered restriction in a 1933 deed. It provided that the land could never be sold, used, occupied, or rented by, quote, any person of the Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood. So the stated purpose of the document was to restrict the use of the cottage community to persons of the white or Caucasian race. So Richmond began an unopposed court action to void the restriction. So he represented Wolfe, while John R. Cartwright, who later became a Chief Justice of Canada, represented the vendor, Andy Noble. So although both lawyers and both the buyer and the seller agreed that the restriction should be struck, when they went to court, the court upheld the validity of the restriction. They said it didn't offend public policy, and the court said, it didn't offend public policy, the court said, and freedom to contract was not to be lightly interfered with. They really believed that this was just a private agreement or contract between two private citizens, that municipalities don't get involved with this. And in fact, municipalities don't sign off on these deeds. So they end up appealing it to the Ontario Court of Appeal. So in January 1949, the Court of Appeal gave a hostile hearing to both lawyers. Barely disguising the anti-Semitism that was so prevalent at the time, 5 justices of the Ontario Court of Appeal agreed with the trial decision and noted that a racist restriction was just to assure that the residents were, quote, of a class who will get along together. And all this information is from this Toronto Star article here. So then the case was brought to the Supreme Court of Canada, who accepted the argument that it was not, so this is how they decided on overturning the restrictions. So they decided that it was not possible to determine with certainty whether the buyer was, quote, of the Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood. So the court reversed the decisions of the lower 2 courts and declared the covenant invalid for uncertainty. Not because it was racist, it's because we can't prove that you're not white. And it also ruled that the restriction was an illegal restraint on an owner's right to sell. So meanwhile, while all this was going on, in Ontario, there was a ruckus about this. This got a lot of play in the newspapers. And so the Ontario government bowed to public pressure as a result of the case and passed a law voiding restrictive covenants entered into after March 24th, 1950. But it did not cancel the older ones. So this was upheld by the courts and the legislature until 1950. So all those properties along the lakefront that had these race restrictions, they would be, and if you come to the archives, and I've had people come to the archives researching their property, and we do come across these old deeds all the time that have these race restrictions that are very troublesome. I want to let you know that the plaque here on the right is a historic site and monuments Board of Canada plaque, and it was put, and that's why this article came up in 2015, because a plaque was unveiled in London, Ontario to commemorate the Supreme Court ruling. So I'm wondering if this bylaw that people do talk about and things that they saw written down, they see this as a part of a deed or a sheet from a deed and just assume that it was a bylaw or something that Kingsville or Gosfield South endorsed or signed off on. And I've yet to find proof that that was ever the case. This was just a contract between 2 private citizens, and it was just registered at the Land Registry Board. Now, talking about people of color being allowed to be in Kingsville, I will say that the Kingsville Reporter was a very kind of liberal-leaning newspaper. They were definitely a temperance newspaper, and they had no problem calling out other communities. And so here we have a postcard of the House of Refuge that was built in Leamington in 1901, also known as the Poor House. And this is now where the Sun Parlor home is on Talbot Street. So this is the original building. And I bring this up because in 1901, it was written in the Kingsville Reporter, quote, "There has been an unwritten law in Leamington that no colored people should be allowed to reside here, but there are breakers ahead now. Leamington has secured the poorhouse, and now it turns out that there are 8 or 10 colored people in North Essex who will have to be domiciled in the new institution as soon as it is completed. A counselor believes he sees a way out of the difficulty without compromising the dignity of the law by whitewashing the whole lot about 3 times a week." So that would be a quote from a Leamington counselor. So in 1901, Kingsville Reporter was calling out Leamington for having this unwritten law. Now, I am not a Kingsville apologist, and I'm not saying just because there wasn't a bylaw about allowing people of color to reside in Kingsville or stay the night in Kingsville doesn't mean that the community was welcoming. Maybe early on it was, but then things change. And even though Old Wash lived here and it was beloved here until 1916, it could also be said that maybe it was because of the personality he was. Maybe he was, to use modern vernacular, Kingsville's token black friend. maybe he was a shield that Kingsville could hide behind, that, hey, no, we like Black people, we have Old Wash. But it could just because he was an eccentric character that was beloved in the community. I don't know. So, there was maybe not a bylaw, but maybe the community wasn't as welcoming as it could have. Because definitely, I'm not aware of many of the original Black settlers in the Salem area having descendants still here. So, again, that's further research needs to be done to find out why these people of color left the area. So whatever the relationship, even after his death, Henry Washington continued to be beloved. I'm going to read to you, sorry, I'm going to read a lot to you, but it's a great story. This is a short story that was published in 1939. So, 20 years after Old Wash had passed away. And it was written by Walter Scratch, who lived in Kingsville, and then he left in 1922 to attend university. So if he was university age in 1922, as a child, he would have memories of Old Wash. So this story was syndicated and published throughout Canada and the US. And it's called Southwind. Now, I will say that they've changed. It's a work of fiction, kind of based a little bit on Old Wash himself. So it's an interesting story, and some of the names have been changed. I'll go through that afterwards. But in this story, Kingsville is known as Erieville. So here we go. Southwind. Erieville called him Old Wash. He called himself George Washington. He was the only Negro in Erieville. He was the lone survivor of a band of escaped slaves that had fled north before the Civil War and finally reached this little fishing village on the Canadian shore of Lake Erie. Nobody knew his name. Old-timers remember sitting on his knee when they were children. Now their grandchildren did the same. The older Old Wash grew, the more his mind reverted to the past. He couldn't recall the 80 or 90 years he served as handyman to a dozen Erieville families, but he'd talk about his arrival as if it were yesterday. We'd all jump off the boat, he'd say, and fill our pockets with the ground. We rubbed the dirt in our hair and raised our hands and shouted, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord, we are free." Then Colonel Green's grandpa gave us the land long down the creek for our cabins. I'll tell you, it's written in a vernacular that people would describe, so I'm trying to translate as I go. Old Wash had one obsession. He feared south winds. That fear dated back to the year after his escape from slavery. It was the year a schooner sailed across Lake Erie from Sandusky, Ohio, under direction of one Kentucky Smith, owner of the escaped slaves. The Negroes took to the bush, but not before 3 of them had been captured and carried back. After that, no Negro ever ventured near the lake when the south wind blew. And after Old Wash's mind did that flip-flop that landed him back in his pre-Civil War past, the old fear returned to him. Old south wind, he'd say with a shake of his cotton white head, don't bring colored folks nothing except bad luck. And that's what he said the day they accused him of the burglary at Colonel King's place and found Mrs. Green's diamond brooch in a pocket of his aged green overcoat. Old Wash used to eat in the kitchen of Erieville's old families. At the time of the burglary, he was showing a preference for the concoctions of Colonel Green's Swedish cook. So every night, except when the south wind blew, he'd eat in the Greens' kitchen while the family dined out inside. It was Marius Peabody, Colonel Green's new secretary, who induced Constable Bartrall to search Old Wash after the burglary. When the constable found the brooch, Old Wash just shook his head dumbly and muttered, "Old south wind, don't bring colored folks nothing except bad luck." They put Old Wash in the village lockup. Constable Bartrall said he had no choice but to comply with the law. Besides, Peabody testified he saw Old Wash loitering around the house after his evening handout. The burglary occurred on the cook's night off, and the Greens had motored to the city. But Peabody, under orders from the colonel, was obliged to feed the Negro from leftovers in the icebox. He testified at Old Wash's trial. The judge was ready to turn the case over to the jury when Colonel Green got the court's permission to question the accused in an effort to find out where the rest of the loot was hidden. "Wash," he said, "what's this you told the judge about the south wind?" "Old south wind," Wash repeated, "don't bring colored folks nothing except bad luck." "Now, Wash," the colonel persisted patiently, "how could the south wind bring you bad luck? It's been 80 years or more since the sailing boat came here to recapture your old friends. Old South Wind, the Negro insisted, must have put that brooch in my pocket. Then Colonel Green saw the light. Your Honor, he exclaimed, do you realize what Old Wash is trying to tell the court? He's saying that there was a south wind the night of the burglary. That means he wouldn't go near the lake because of his superstition. That means he didn't take his meal at my house that night. In fact, he thinks the evil south wind put that brooch in his pocket. Half of Erieville was in the courthouse, and everyone started to talk at once. There had been a storm off the lake that night of the burglary. They shouted about broken windows, uprooted plants, wrecked chimneys, all on that night. When the bailiff finally quieted them down, Colonel Green asked permission to continue. Your Honor, he said, we residents of Erieville know of our colored citizens' fear of the south wind. We would never accuse him of committing a crime near the lake when a south wind was blowing. No one would accuse him, but a stranger in Erieville? Yes, Your Honor, the man who accused Old Wash is a stranger. Peabody made the open window in 2 leaps, but the bailiff caught his coat tail as he went through. He held on until Constable Bartrall collared the culprit outside. Peabody confessed to the crime then and there and admitted to slipping the brooch into Old Wash's pocket the day after the burglary. Constable Bartrall tried his best to explain things to Old Wash. He held the glittering brooch close to the old fellow's eyes and said, see, Wash, the south wind is giving it back to Colonel Green. Old Wash stared fondly at the trinket. Old south wind, he sighed, don't bring colored folks nothing except bad luck. So very interesting that it starts out a history of this beloved character and turned into a courtroom drama. So this story was syndicated and it went all over. It was repeated and repeated. And I will say that obviously the name of Kingsville was named to Erieville. I think it's interesting that they talk about a Colonel Green. There was no Colonel Green in Kingsville, but there was a Curtis Green, and he was married to Colonel King's granddaughter. So it talked about Colonel Green's grandfather letting the slaves build shacks on his property. That could be Colonel King doing that. And so he was married to Colonel King's granddaughter, Fanny, and they lived in Birchley Villa on Park Street, which is where Southgate Retirement Home is right now. So it is definitely where the south winds would blow in. And so I think, and the story about Colonel Green's grandpa giving us land down along the creek for our cabins lines up with the oral history of Colonel King giving refuge to people escaping enslavement. So not only do we have this story that was written, and I think it's also very interesting that it was written in the 1930s about a beloved Black character as well, and how he turned out to be the wronged, hero of the story. And when I was researching at the Freedom Museum in Amherstburg, they actually, in their collection, have an oil painting of Old Wash. And so this was painted by, F.D. Ride, so a Kingsville resident. And so they actually have it, and this is from their collection. So people writing stories about this character and painting portraits of him. And to end this presentation, I'd like to give a little snippet from the Kingsville Reporter from 1916. This is before Old Wash passed away. And this is the fun things that they used to write in newspapers. A little lad last week inquired of his father the meaning of Good Friday. He was told that it was the day the Savior was crucified. But, said the father, that was a long time ago, and there's nobody living now that was living then. What? Said the astonished Kitty. Wasn't Old Wash? And that's the story of Old Wash in Kingsville's Black History.